and welcome you all to the session, which we can now maybe begin. My name is Kiran Mirchandani. I teach at OISI, and this session is, I think, one of the very few that focus specifically on South Asia. In relation to labor process. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing all of your insights on this topic. I thought, Nilofar, I don't know if you want to say a word or two about the South Asia Interest Group at OISI before we begin. And I'm not sure if you're able to do that. I should have checked with you before.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kiran. Is my audio okay?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much. The South Asian Interest Group is an interest group which is developed at the Comparative International Development Department at OISI, and we have scholars, researchers, students, faculty who are not only from who have joined us not only from OISI but also from other universities and other institutions from the North America and also from the global South or South Asia. This panel is an endeavor to bring scholars together from different parts of the world so that people would know about the current situation of education and development, and also to mobilize knowledge about South Asian studies. We are very thankful to Dr. Kiran Mirchandani, who has been supporting us from the day one and guiding us with valuable feedback and all the possible support that she can. And we are really grateful for her to agree to chair this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have two presenters who are two founding members who are presenting today, and we look forward to Sarita to join us actively in our group. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so why don't we start, Sarita, if you could begin. I would really like it if each of you, before you begin, could just introduce yourselves for, in terms of your bio for a minute before you begin your presentations. I think that would be really helpful. So welcome, Sarita.
Thank you so much, Kiran. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarita Sharma. I am one of the co-founders and academic lead at the organization, The Teacher App. We started our exploration in 2016, and we work in the space of in-service teacher education through digital mode. Happy to be here and feel grateful to have an opportunity to listen to all of you and your insights about education and policies and praxis. Let me share my screen and then I can start my presentation. Is it visible to everyone? So this paper is co-written by Vinod Karate, our CEO and founder, and myself. When we started our exploration in 2016, our vision was that every teacher should be able to learn and grow anytime, anywhere at zero cost. To set a bit of a context here, the public education system of India is one of the largest education system in India. It serves around 260 million teachers and has the mandate of providing quality education under the ambit of Right to Education Act. This entire large pool of people working in education sector, teachers constitute the biggest part. There are around 10 million teachers in India. This figure is from 2015, and we probably will be doubling this number in around 6 years now. Teacher recruitment, timely remunerations, managing, retaining them are an important factor. But in service teacher development, support is a humongous challenge in India, especially because it needs to be done at a scale. And probably a lot of examples and models are available, but they are island of excellence, and nothing going to scale has sort of sustained its quality so far. How do we train this large pool of labor and set themselves for better service, better work? So satisfaction as well as their well-being has been our exploration. If we look at in-service teacher education at scale, the State Council of Education and Research and Training is responsible at each state level through their local organizations like DIETs, block resource centers, and cluster resource centers. Financial aid for a lot of in-service teacher education comes from SSA, and it is mandated that around 21 days of teacher training needs to happen for experienced teachers every year in India, and more for new recruits. What happens on the ground is pretty problematic. None of the states are able to do more than 2 to 3 days of in-service training in India right now. All the teachers who have B.Ed degrees and they appear for teacher eligibility test, 6 out of 7 teachers fail that test. There are also widespread reports around large number of teachers not having conceptual and pedagogical depth. There was a study done by BCG last year in Jharkhand which showed that around 60% teachers didn't understand the concepts at the grade level that they were teaching. Another organization, CENTA, also talks about subject pedagogy knowledge being such a great issue and challenge for teachers who are teaching in Indian schools right now. And there are very few alternatives for teachers to train themselves. And whenever there's a training that happens, it is always mandated by the national guidelines and probably by NCERT diets and then going to the teachers. So teachers find most of these trainings not valuable for themselves. In Himachal, there was a study done and around 19% teachers shared that probably the teacher training that was done was not useful for them. And there is also a lot of absenteeism in these trainings because of that. A lot of women also find it very tough to go and attend these trainings at some centralized place as well. So cascade creates a huge issue about this trickling effect on quality in India. And we thought probably a solution which is in the hands of teachers can create some kind of support mechanism for teachers where they go through some training and they can always go back to it because it's in their hands. So we had certain assumptions or a theory of change at that point in time that we thought we'll work on it. One is that we will unlock this content in the form of a digital learning experience, and we will identify individuals and also organizations, and will create a robust pipeline of people digitizing for teachers who have themselves been either very good teachers or teacher educators. Once we do that and connect this content to teachers at the last mile with a very simple but robust platform and distribute it through partners and states, then probably because of this availability of content and this behavior changing, there might be certain outcomes that we can see gradually. And we decided our uh, uh, success very frugally at that point in time. Then probably one of the first outcomes that we see or impact that we see would be just creating more access to continuous professional development of teachers. Probably it will improve their practice gradually and then students' learning outcomes eventually. So when we started operating, we operated at all 4 levels. That let's unlock content, which is research based, which is useful for teachers, which is near to teachers' practices. Let's work on a very robust distribution strategy, build a very robust platform, and then look at impact in terms of how it happens on the ground. We had a lot of questions in all 4 areas, and our explorations have been in all 4 areas. Probably to keep the economics of the time for this presentation, I will talk about the content unlocking more and probably share some of the numbers in terms of access and sharing from the users in terms of how they find our content. When 2010, the MOOC revolution started happening, everybody thought that probably the training at scale kind of a problem would be solved by MOOC, but it didn't sort of work out the way the world imagined it to be. The completion rates of the MOOCs are as low as 2% to 7%. Recorded lectures don't engage users, and they're too long for teachers' attention and motivation. And probably also the monetization pressures have stifled the format innovation for teacher training in India. And we thought that we required some kind of a new format to support teachers in government school, uh, where probably it's not also their first level need, that they would definitely latch on to something that is being provided to them. And we thought of this unique content format from three lenses: that what should be the content, what should be the engagement, what should create the engagement, and how the access barrier can be broken. At the level of content, we thought that if we want our teachers to build constructivist pedagogy in classrooms, they should experience that first as learners as well. So what it means to be in a process where you're not given a one-sided lecture and you're asked to think about questions, you're asked to relate this to your own classroom experiences, reflect on your experiences as a learner in your childhood, and keep relating what is being taught at a theoretical level to your practice as well, and have ample amount of classroom practices in that module. Another aspect was that it has to be interactive in nature. So probably on the screen, the user needs to get back to the screen again and again rather than passively listening. At the level of engagement, we thought that it has to be audio visual, because a lot of adults don't want to read. They don't have the time and space to sit and read probably. And it should be done in a friendly language so that it breaks the barrier of language as well. And in India, our focus was this whole entire so-called Hindi belt, where Hindi is the second language to a lot of people, and probably that could become the language for learning rather than English. It has to be modular and short to create engagement. At the level of access, we thought that it has to work on basic mobile, should consume less than 100 MB, should be offline accessible, and should be open source material. So far, we've created three products in this realm of sweet spot. One is the courses, which are around 45 minutes to 1 hour long audiovisual experiences around first language pedagogy, maths pedagogy, some bit of science, and a lot of generic pedagogical principles that apply to all subject learning. We have created 77 so far. Then we created 5 to 7 minutes audio chats. We call them Chat Shala. And this was also a lot of reflective content around introducing teachers to different kinds of books that they can be reading, excerpts from the books, teacher reflections that a lot of teachers wrote, two teachers talking, all sorts of formats we sort of innovated in this. And the toolkit videos were around 5 to 7 minutes long videos where one teacher teaching learning material, how it is made, how do you plan for it in the classroom, and how it is used in the classroom was shown. There were certain activities also we showed rather than just teacher training, teaching learning material in these toolkits. We have created around 74 so far and podcasts around 42. With this kind of a content for 2 years, we thought that let's create at least that amount of content which creates certain kind of a user behavior. Otherwise, it will be futile to share it with a heterogeneous large number of people, and probably they'll consume it faster and then there will be nothing. This kind of content creation takes a lot of time to make. I could sort of show a sample here, but probably it's in Hindi and I thought there's no time for this. If there's time left, gradually probably I'll show a sample. I'll share some of the strategic decisions we took, and this book informed us about it. When we had this question in terms of how do you know that whatever you will create, there will be takers of that. And this book says that if there's a digital platform, whatever you create and put out, at least everything will be consumed once in 1 quarter. And so it will create a very long tail of consumption. So don't fear this, that there will be takers or no takers to this kind of a content, and create something which is useful for teachers and have this conviction that there will be takers. So probably with that feeling, we started it, this exploration, and then created a user study, initial user study for first 500 users of ours. But this rule But this rule of 98% works if the marketplace is able to democratize production and break the barriers between users and product. And one of the strategies that we used was very different from all the other digital platforms, because what happens there is a very slow path to causing behavior change. Either it's Facebook or in YouTube, they crowdsource content, the behavior change, rich analytics happened, marketplace was created, and then exemplary content started getting created because now there was a market for that. While in teacher education, you can't let that happen. You have to have seasoned educators creating high quality content that changes behavior, rich analytics will happen, and gradually, because of that, more exemplary content will be created, and probably crowdsourcing can then happen when people have understood what kind of a content works for teachers more. Otherwise, a lot of state governments in India right now, what they do with digital content is that they ask at scale with every teacher to create content and post it on different digital platform, and how they're teaching in classroom is shown in the digital content as well. Nothing changes. It's only the format which changes. So the digital itself is not progressive. Digital is just a format. So we thought that this strategy would work best for us. We started creating the primary content more because more teachers are at that level. And we thought that all the progressive teaching concepts are the best lever to change classroom practices, and they can improve teachers' capacity and impact student learning outcomes. So we thought that we will use this lever more rather than any other aspect of teaching, learning, content or curriculum for teacher education. I will straight away go to some of the numbers. Right now, the total number of users on the teacher app are around 290,000 people, and we have two platform strategy right now. So Diksha is a platform that Ministry of Human Resource and Development has. It's Diksha, and because of that, there are around 6 lakh users there. We have around active users which are 57,000. Explorer are around 115,000. Number of users returning per month were around 32,000, but during COVID in May, June, the number increased to around 45,000. Because the moment there was a lockdown, every state wanted teachers to be engaged. I'll sort of stop it here, and if there are any questions in the Q&A rounds, I'll be happy to share about platform distribution strategy and any other number. We are not looking at COVID as an opportunity. I hope it sort of ends very soon, and so these hype numbers don't excite us so much. Was the last point I wanted to say. One of the interesting thing for us is that the cost per user for us right now is around $6.4, which is very cheap at a scale for teacher training, and probably if states want to invest in something like this as a teacher support model, this has a lot of potential. But let's see, we are sitting on our randomized control test soon with MSDF in Himachal, and let's see what results it sort of throws to us. We've been doing some small user studies, and teachers do like our content a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sarita. Very interesting. So let's move on to Mohammed. And as I said, after the 4 presentations, we can maybe take questions. So please keep note of all your questions.
Sure. Thank you very much. I'm sharing my screen and just confirm if you are able to see it.
Yes, we can all see it.
Okay, thanks again. The topic is the role of evidence-based policy dialogue to improve quality primary education in Bangladesh to reach developed country status. Just to give you a little background, Bangladesh has made tremendous strides in terms of economic growth and development. So that gave the present government the confidence and hope that by 2041, Bangladesh will reach to the developed country status that requires Bangladesh's per capita income to reach $12,000 per person. Currently, it is around $2,000. So I would like to say this is a very, very ambitious plan. But we also want to keep the hope alive. And as a student of education, I strongly believe in order for us to reach to that kind of goal, education, to be very frank, the quality education is a must. So what we have seen from the literature and also working in this field for about 20 years now, that quality, equity, these two things are seriously compromised in all of the South Asian countries. So let me share some facts and figures. So coming back, for the ILERA part, quality of education, I just wanted to handpick a couple of sustainable development goals that are very much connected to education. But as a student of education, I would also like to say that education cuts across all other goals too. But for ILERA purpose, I would like to say gender equality and decent work and no poverty. These three goals are heavily dependent on education. So the goal 4, which is the educational goal for the sustainable development goal, it talks about inclusivity, equitable quality education, and lifelong learning opportunity. So how lifelong learning will happen if a child leaves after graduating from primary school without any functional skill, without the ability to read with comprehension, without the ability to read, without the ability to do basic arithmetic problem solving. So I thought the quality is a must. And this will also, this has the quality of education, although, just keep the quality part aside. If we just focus on the literacy, if you see in this figure, it shows the country's per capita income and in relation to their literacy skills. So if you can see, like the Pakistan and Nepal are at the bottom. Bangladesh is like little above, and Sri Lanka is on the top. And this is, this is evidence based, and we see a clear cut kind of correlation. And if we go a little deeper, I put all those countries that I presented in the previous graph, that the literacy rate in the year 2000, and the literacy rate and then their per capita income in constant price improved from 2000 to 2016. Almost all of the countries have doubled their per capita income, and that has a clear kind of link with their increase in literacy rate. There are a few exceptions. Some countries have like not just double, like quadrupled their per capita income. China is an example. So if you see in 2000, Sri Lanka and China were like very kind of close, but just by improving their like Chinese education that are like technology based and that provides like more hands-on training to the students and to acquire like lifelong skills to be a productive worker in their manufacturing industry, they increased their per capita income substantially and much more than other countries were. So from this relationship, we felt that if South Asia, not just in Bangladesh, if South Asia wants to get rid of the poverty, then education can be the most important area for future investment. But as we look back, I mean, all of the states in like South Asian countries and all of the countries that government and also others are claiming that they're improving the literacy rate. But when it comes to comprehension, we do not actually see much progress except for Sri Lanka. In most of the countries, children are able to read, but by the time they finish a sentence, they forget what they have read in the beginning of the sentence, which means they are not actually able to read with comprehension. And fluency is one of the factors for the students not being able to read with comprehension. So I just wanted to show some link between the fluency and comprehension. So there are a strong correlation between fluency and comprehension, which means that we need to improve students' comprehension level, perhaps by improving their reading fluency. And one good thing about Bangladesh is that Bangladesh has achieved gender parity, both in terms of students enrollment and also teacher recruitment. I mean, when many other developing countries are debating that how can they improve girls' education, Bangladesh perhaps needs to launch a special project to improve boys' education. More girls are in the school than boys, and we have roughly, I think, above 60% teachers in primary school who are female teachers. So what we need to do, if we look back at how government spends, I mean, their spending nature and their spending trend in education has not changed that much. Governments in almost all of the South Asian countries feel that they are giving a service to the citizen. But I think we need to actually change this mentality. We need to consider our schools and education institutions as a place for our investment, not as a cost center. Just as a side note, I was observing the Delhi election a few months ago, and I was trying to analyze within myself that how and why did they do so well. And one information that struck in my mind is their spending for education. They have roughly invested 25% of their total budget for education, and that resulted better performance of their public schools that were not doing that well in the past. Then the other things that we need to actually do is the primary and secondary education should be learning outcome focused, not just enrollment, dropout, completion. I mean, these things like are discussed so widely, and the countries are given like so much appreciation by United Nations organizations and also a few other organizations. But that is not actually enough. I mean, if the children are in the school and they're not learning the basic reading skills and math skills, I mean, that enrollment doesn't actually make any sense. The third thing is, which is close to Sarita's presentation, we need to attract more quality, capable kind of teachers into our system. And that requires like a lot of things. It's not just one solution. There are so many other factors that needs to be done, like teachers' salary structure needs to be substantially revised. More investment, as I mentioned, it should be considered as a future investment for the South Asian countries. And who else can actually influence students learning better than the teachers? And if we, as we discussed, education is considered as the cost center by almost all of the South Asian countries. The high stake examination is also creating much problem, because government always wants to demonstrate that this much they have allocated in last year budget, and this many students have passed their central exam. Like in Bangladesh, we have 4 exams in primary, like grade 5, grade 8, grade 10, and grade 12. And they always want to show a natural kind of progress. And in order to do that, there are like huge pressure, undue pressure on the students and children by the school, by the education system, that the number should not go down. it doesn't matter whether they are really learning anything or not. So that high stake of like public examination needs to be removed. And I'm jumping to the third bullet of this slide, and come back to the second bullet later on. So that requires, I would say, instead of a more centralized kind of system of education, we need a lot of decentralization. We need to actually return the power to the school, to the principals, to the teachers, and not just the power of teaching, but also the power of their own budgeting, planning, and everything. So what can we actually do next? In order, as I mentioned, in order to do this policy, evidence-based policy debate, we need a strong partnership. We need a strong partnership among the government, government function, the government, like the bureaucrats, both political leadership and bureaucratic leaderships. We need partnership with the line directorates and ministries. We need partnerships with civil society organizations, NGOs, and development partners. And in order to do that, how can we create evidence as a way forward? This is something that I have been working for since 2017, and we have made a lot of progress in that regard. So we thought, why don't we do a longitudinal study, which will be conducted in every 2 or 3 years kind of interval. So this study will track the progress of children, like students, who can read their grade level text with enough fluency and comprehension, and also to be able to solve the basic math operations at grade 2 level and grade 5 level, so that we know for sure that by the end of their primary schooling, they are able to read with comprehension. And we negotiated this project with the Institute of Education and Research in Dhaka, Bangladesh. Dhaka University has joined us. And recently, I have not mentioned it here, another university, the second oldest university in Bangladesh, Rajshahi University, has also joined this initiative. Simon Fraser University is also a part of this process. Recently, I have been negotiating this with Ontario, like OIZ at University of Toronto. Recently, Karen Mundi have given her consent to be a part of it, but we are in the process of making an institutionalizing this partnership instead of just depending on the individual. And in the next phase, we also, after we build this university consortium for this study, we are planning to broaden our consortium by involving the Directorate of Primary Education, who are the most, the only official education service provider in Bangladesh. And in order to bring European university on board, we are also discussing with Oxford University, their international education department. There are some positive, there are some progresses, but I cannot claim that they will be on board very soon. But there are good progresses. And what we are going to do in this core project, as I said, it's a longitudinal study, and we are doing the learning assessment, and we will be making we'll produce reports and that are publicly available, like ACER, and I don't know if you are familiar with it. Pratham, the Indian NGO, they are conducting this type of study, but only big difference between Pratham and our approach will be the reading with comprehension part, because they do not have the comprehension part in it. They are focusing on only on the fluency part. And the sub-component will be, so after we conduct this study, we will heavily engage the institutions that what needs to be done. And as you see, the Canadian universities and Bangladeshi universities are part of it. So we will try to do some faculty exchanges, and also the student internship from the partnering university, like the students from these universities can do exchange programs. And we will periodically publish our findings through peer-reviewed journals. And as we in the beginning, as we will start in Bangladesh, But if we can leverage enough resource, then we will expand our project to other South Asian countries. And hopefully in future, we will expand it to African region. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. So maybe we can move on to Sarah.
Hi, all right. Let me just share screen. Okay, Mohammed, can you stop sharing your screen? So
Yeah, I
can
did.
share? All right. All right. So, hello everyone and good morning. I am Sara Alam. I am a member of South Asia Interest Group. I am a doctoral student at SJE, which is the Social Justice Education Department at OIC at the University of Toronto. And my doctoral research focus is on bonded labor and modern slavery. I'd like to start off my presentation by acknowledging the land where the University of Toronto is located and the history of University of Toronto. And also acknowledge and express my gratitude and sincere thanks to my professor, Dr. Shehzad Majid, for providing me an opportunity to write this paper under her supervision as part of our course assignment, which I took with her, which was Women, Migration and Work. So my today's topic of the presentation is women labor migration in South Asia, the issues and challenges in an era of globalization. It is quite a shift from what my other colleagues have discussed, which was heavily focused on education. But this is going to be more focused on the exploitation of women that takes place in South Asia, and especially the migrant workers that rotate within South Asia. So the need for the paper arises from the fact that although women workers are a core part of the global economy, their contributions and the abuses they experience often remain invisible. So my research question is that how labor power is impacting the flow of women migrant workers in developing South Asian countries such as India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, some of the issues and challenges they are experiencing. And this is the overview of the presentation. My research has been focusing on qualitative research methodology and is dependent on literature review and secondary data available. And in today's presentation, I am going to provide the theoretical framework for my research, as well as some of the challenges and issues that the women have been experiencing in South Asia. So as Das has rightly quoted Karl Marx in defining the way capitalism works to exploit labor power, the theoretical framework of the paper is dependent on the concept of labor power and reproduction as presented by Michelle Murphy and Helen Colley. The International Labour Organization report published in 2019 provides statistics on labor force, which relates to the two concepts of labor power and reproduction. In the light of the ILO report findings, I have looked at the statistical data available in the report on forced labor, flow of migration, and the role of women. The ILO reports and the two concepts have made me address the broader discussion of exploitation of women labor power in third world countries such as India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Women's labor force tends to increase due to a number of factors, which include social, education, and economic factors. There are various advantages and disadvantages to the women participation in the labor force. Though the advantages lead to a number of, the disadvantages lead to a number of exploitation and challenges posed to the well-being of women laborers. Exploitation is very common around the world and is not just focused on women, but men are equally, exploited. but the ratio of women being exploited is very high, especially in our part of the region, which is the 3 countries that we are representing from South Asia. Forced labor, debt bondage, and human trafficking is the most extreme form of human exploitation and also the most common element of modern day slavery. With an increase in regional migration observed within East and South Asian countries, an expanding number of women are taking part in domestic as well as cross-border movements in the search for work. A significant portion of migrant workers also serve as forced laborers through human trafficking and illegal migration. The demand and supply of women laborers is boosting the labor market and enabling capitalism to thrive, since in the new liberal world, according to many profound scholars, the markets have taken over the lives of individuals where capital gains are first and human rights and values have become secondary. According to ILO reports, Asia region bags the highest percentage of forced laborers. According to the report, nearly 56% in comparison with other regions such as Africa and Latin America. Forced labor is the worst form of exploitation that occurs in third world countries. According to the 2018 ILO report, nearly 21 million people are affected by forced labor, 70% of which belong to South Asian region. This graph indicates the percentage of exploitation of laborers as projected by ILO. It reflects around 66% laborers face some sort of exploitation at work, whereas roughly 17% of the total population of laborer is exploited through forced labor. And there's only 5% of the total population of laborers which are not impacted by exploitation. Migrant labor workers can be classified into different categories. It is interesting to note that ILO highlights majority of the migrant and forced laborers are women, and they equally participate in most of these categories, especially the domestic work and the sex industry, which is highly dependent on women. While the other fields such as agriculture, brick kilns, manufacturing, processing, and packaging, women equally work side by side with men, but do not earn a fair wage as compared to their male colleagues. Forced labor targets the weaker segment of society, which includes women and migrant workers. ILO indicates that these women and migrant workers are exploited through unpaid wages, working from early morning to late night with few or no breaks, physical confinement in the workplaces, and in some cases, physical or sexual abuse. According to ILO, domestic work is the most common form of employment for women migrant workers. Such workers often have channels for redress or information about the legal protections they may be entitled to. Very few countries have labor laws that protect the interest of migrant workers. Only 10% of only 10% of women domestic workers worldwide are employed in countries that extend them equal protection under national labor laws. Some 30% of the work in countries ranging from UAE and Singapore, etc., do not have any forms of labor laws protections. Others, such as the United States and Canada, provide guarantee the minimum wage, but do not let them form unions. Women migrant workers' challenges cannot be addressed without addressing the overall women labor issues in South Asia, as they are connected. It is a sad reality that women's work to date has been highly undervalued and is often neglected. Women account for 71% of modern day slavery victims and are paid less. There are numerous forms of exploitation that occur in the different industries, including domestic work, agriculture, sex industry, factory workers. The kinds of exploitation the women suffer at the hands of their employers fits the definition of modern slavery. When we talk about women and migrant labor exploitation in South Asia, I cannot overlook the multiple case stories that validate the nature of exploitation that occurs in these countries. 3 of the case stories that I have taken for this paper include, and we cannot, move ahead without discussing the Rana Plaza incident, which happened in 2013 and killed nearly 1,000, laborers in that incident, majority of which were women. And besides that, the Baldia factory incident, which happened in Karachi and kind of like, impacted majority of the migrant workers, which came to Karachi to work from Bangladesh. Another recent incident is of a 8-year-old female domestic worker who was killed for setting some birds free by, she was killed by her employers. She was originally from southern part of Punjab in Pakistan and moved to work in an work at a family, work with a family, in Rawalpindi, where she uncaged some birds and was so much tortured that she succumbed to her injuries and died while reaching the hospital. Another noteworthy incident is where a 42-year-old mother of two talked about, the wage exploitation that she experiences at the hands of her employers, who are suppliers of, products to Gap and other notable industries abroad. I would definitely like to share this documentary, and since we have, limited time, I'm not going to share this documentary, but would like to, refer that to you, that please take a look at it. This is the Rana Plaza collapse documentary, the deadliest cost of fashion. Please search for it on YouTube and look at it. And that talks about the horrific conditions some of the factory workers experience within, these three countries. And then again, this doesn't end here. They are, prone to different sorts of challenges, homophobic and transphobic attitudes, legal protection against discrimination and sexual harassment that they face at work. Physical abuse is just like one of the most common thing that they experience. Some of the policy recommendations that I have is that people need to, ensure that there's fair and effective labor laws, and governments need to take up that, they enforce these laws implementation. There are stronger social protection systems in place where migrant laborers or laborers can, reach out, and social rights are, made available. Victim identification and protection is in place in consultation with law enforcement agencies. Accurate information and data compilation is done by NGOs, as well as awareness of labor rights and access to labor laws is made possible. I'm reaching out to the Pakistan Institute of Labor Education and Research organization, PILA, where I would be working with them in policy development to ensure that, labor laws are protected, and any kind of support can be extended from my side to them. And that is what my today's presentation is about.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So maybe we can move on then to Asan.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. Before you get disappointed from my presentation, I apologize because you may know that Dhaka now in hard-hit pandemic situation, so I couldn't finish data collection, but I do not want to. I want to take the advantage of you guys advice on my presentation. So my presentation is about the education and employability for the madrasa students, because madrasa is religious education in Bangladesh. And I will start with a little bit of background so it will be easier for us to get the context. At the moment, we have three streams of education: general education, like typically primary, secondary, and we have madrasa education, and technical education started from grade 8. But why madrasa education is important here? Because you see that madrasa education system caters 30% of the total education in Bangladesh. So it's a huge number of students are starting here, almost 5.8 million students altogether, madrasa students, and is registered, but there should be more because many of madrasas are directed by the non-government institution, which is not being registered in the government system. So it's more than that.
Hassan,
Usually we have
continue. Sorry, I just
Yeah.
wanted to check that I don't see any slides. I do see your screen sharing.
don't?
But I don't. No, I do see your screen is being shared, but the slides are not operating. So maybe just wanted to confirm that you wanted to. I know that earlier you had slides, so
Yeah. Okay. Let me check again and share
yeah,
it again.
please do. Yeah. Yes.
Can you see it now?
Yes, now it's perfect. Sorry, please continue.
Thank you. As I was saying that I will start with, now I cannot, okay, fine. Start with the background of the madrasa education in Bangladesh. So as you see, one of the stream of madrasa education, and it has a huge share in mainstream education. And there is two kinds of madrasa education in Bangladesh. One is Qawmi Madrasa we call, and another one is Aliyah Madrasa. The difference between these two is Aliyah Madrasa is combined, national curriculum along with faith-based education. So they teach Quran and Hadith, religious text, as well as language, mathematics, science, and general subjects. On the other hand, Qawmi Madrasa, fully faith-based education, they only teach Islamic text. So this context have implication with employability, we'll later come to know. But there is another one we have that's called Tafizul Quran, that means memorization of Islamic text by heart. And this subject content can be both in Qawmi Madrasa and Aliyah Madrasa. And usually madrasa education has the system very much linked with general education. For example, primary education, they have also primary education called Ibtidia, 5 years. They have 5 years secondary education, they call Dakhil, and they have higher education, 2 years intermediate education before go to the higher education called Alim. And they have also 3 and 4 years graduate that called Fazil, and they have a master's program called Kamil and Daura, equivalent to madrasa, equivalent to JEL master's program. And historical background of madrasa education is dated back to the Muslim Islamic Sultanate establishment in Delhi, which is general purpose was to teach Islamic rules, regulation, rituals. But later, the establishment of British rule, as you know, that British period, the Persian language was used. So they want people who spell madrasa first. So Aliyah Madrasa was established first, like in British period. And that legacy brings now that madrasa education now have, even in education policy, two aims and goals, and two kind of contradictory, and this also has implication with the employability. In one hand, it has aims to provide the understanding of Islamic rituals, spirituality, and those things. On the other hand, it same as the practical life oriented education. So these both things is being in the documented in the policy for national policy guideline. But this is, we know that this is for the government part, but for Alia and Qaumi Madrasa, they have their own kind of policy and belief system. So I'm not going to this, just to say that the percentage you see that the madrasa education in different sector, for example, Ibtidia 44%. I mean, if you see the percentage here, same as as Shohid also mentioned, that the Ibtidia, I mean, the primary started with huge number of students, gradually decreased when they go for masters. So there is a huge number of dropout over the period. And madrasa education also managed by, in Bangladesh, in different institution. For we have the government madrasa, Alia madrasas, they are directed by the they have a directorate, government directorate for the Alia madrasa. Also there is a board to assessment and taking examination. There is also training institution, and also there is a Islamic Arabic university to affiliate the master's program for the who graduate from Alia Kamil Madrasa. But there are no such a government institution directly to control the Qaumi Madrasa. So what's the problem? The problem is that finding shows that 75% of the madrasa students remain unemployed in one hand. On the other hand, in the policy, we have now the government try to impose technical education in the madrasa. So before going to that, whether madrasa wants technical education or not, because of the philosophical or their education aims and objective, where it's aligned with their education or not, and also the unemployment, and also the security issues. That's why madrasa education is a bit interesting nowadays of these strategic issues in Bangladesh and around South Asia. So the problem we raised here, that one hand the unemployment, and the other hand government want to employ technical education, and whether madrasa is ready for that, or madrasa students are ready for that. That's why the study we have proposed, we have taken that with the 4 research question. One, how the employability has been perceived by the madrasa education teachers and their parents, and what the employment sector after secondary education existing situation, and what the existing employability opportunity for the higher education, I mean for Fazil Al Kamil graduates. And also there is another question of what's the major challenges in job sector for madrasa education. For this 4 research question, we initially designed a mixed method research design, where for quality data we supposed to take interview and focus group, and for quantitative we plan to develop a survey scale, job preference and perception scale for the students to know that what kind of jobs they really want to, and how do they think about their employment in future. So that part totally been stopped because of the pandemic. So far what we have done, that only the interviews with some teachers, but we want to move on. But I want to show you was a glimpse of the result from their interview. About the employability issues, we see the 2 parts. One is from Alia Madrasa, because of the government approval, teachers are perceived that employability have no issue for them, because it's almost same as the general education. They can go for anywhere, any job, from finance, banking. Is both from their opportunity and also from the perception, because they study science, language, all the courses in general education the students do. On the other hand, Qaumi teachers have a have hardly mentioned about the jobs related to money generation, but they're more about religious teaching, preaching, and ritual, those kind of, because on the Qaumi education aims to get knowledge for after death. So there is a, okay, thank you. We have, that's perception, the philosophical difference between these two groups. What you get after secondary education, we see the Dakil Madrasa, mostly they continue for general education. Some of them go for agriculture workshop after secondary school, and or for working the mosque as imam or other stuff. But also surprised that many of them like to go to the security force, and they went security force like police, armed forces, and those kind of groups. And after general education, Kamil and Fazil graduation, mostly Aliyah Madrasa, they are similar as general education. They go for religious institution, bank, financial organization, civil service, all kind of civil servants, and mostly like to go for teaching. The major challenges that we have found that teachers mentioned, there is a perception of negative perception about their appearance because they sometimes put beard and dress up. There is also a recruitment process. There is a general perception that madrasa student may not good enough to do some smarter job in the bank or in the civil service. So they may get sometimes defiled or in the recruitment board. And but for Qaumi Madrasa, there is some issue of degree equivalence because the degree has not been approved by the government. So even though they have master's program, but sometimes they don't get job because of their degree issues. So that's so far we have done, but we have worked left a lot that like we want to know students' perception and voice, what they want, how they think about their future, and whether they want technical education or not. Also, we want to know about teachers' perception, how do they think about their student future employability, and also is there any capacity of madrasa to diversify the employment opportunity from the beginning, I mean from the secondary education, like introducing technical education or not. So we have still work to do. I would like to stop here and rather want your comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sam, and thank you all. Let me thank you all for keeping within your time because that gives us the opportunity to have some time for discussion. I want to just, give you a minute to think about your questions. And I thought what we could do is just invite everybody who has questions to put them forward, and then we'll allow people to respond, as they think is appropriate. So also I want to say that there's a comment on the chat just asking for permission to take a screenshot of our session. So if you're okay with that, that's fine. If you're not okay with that, in the next couple of minutes, if you could just reply on the chat, that would be great. So any comments or questions that you'd like to put forward, and as I said, we can take several and then, respond to them.
I have got, okay. So go ahead.
So Hassan and Mohammed both have a comment. So why don't you just start? Hassan, Mohammed, please start.
Okay, yes.
My question to Sarita, very nice presentation. And especially, we never expect, as you mentioned, that we don't want to take the opportunity that COVID has broadened the scope of your work. But just a quick question, the training that you provide through the app, do you also want to see, based on the training, what is the performance gained by the students who received your training? What are the changes in terms of students' learning outcome?
Sarita, could you keep some notes and we'll just take a few questions and then maybe you can return to answer them as a group because there might be some overlap. Hassan, please, could you make your comment?
my question also to, not question, the comments to Sharida. I have been developing the similar idea and proposing it for a funding that this particular COVID pandemic time, how we can develop localized learning environment, learning community. And I think Sari's idea is very good for that, that school, we don't need to teacher education, you know, even for Bangladesh, we have a huge number of teachers, and going for those face-to-face teaching is almost now impossible. So developing apps or developing school-based training through putting resources somewhere where a teacher can access, and also a community that teacher can engage with that, and they can also put their teaching through reflective practice or through video and show it to others, and they go for each other, you know, some kind of local community learning space. Excellent, appreciate your work. Thank you.
There is a question from Asmita on the chat, which I will just read out. It says, thank you all for your presentations. For all of those who've presented on educational projects in particular, what impact do you think the current pandemic has on teacher agency? What are the particular structural barriers or possibilities that the pandemic has brought about? I guess I also wanted to just throw in a question there for you to consider, which is, I'm struck by the fact that many of you, you know, have presented on the need really to improve educational outcomes, you know, whether they are to, you know, provide better education for the teachers who will be teaching students, or whether it's to focus more on comprehension, whether it's to, you know, integrate employability into education. But I wanted to ask whether you think that improving educational outcomes will lead to automatically or in some way lead to less exposure to forced labor jobs that Sarah talked about, or whether there would be, whether improving these educational outcomes would in fact interrupt this practice of capital to place particular workers into forced labor positions. So I suppose I kind of want to consider the link between that economic reality for many workers and the educational outcomes that you all talked about. So are there other comments or questions?
So Kiran, can I just add with your comments? That's the reason I want to do this study, because particularly in Bangladesh, everything is centralized. We have little voice from the teachers. Particularly this pandemic time, every decision has been taken from the central and giving it to the teachers. Same as, like, we think that the Madrasa students are not having jobs, so probably we need to teach them technical education without asking them whether they want it or not, whether they like it or not. That's what we need, teachers' voice, also student voice on their decision. That's what I'm saying. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So maybe we can then just go around and have each of you consider this group of questions that you've heard and make a comment or two, and then we'll take another round of questions. So should we just go in the order that you had spoken and make a couple of comments, brief comments? So Sarita, do you want to start?
Yeah, so there was a specific question around understanding whether the kind of training we provide is impacting student learning outcome and how do we assess that. And Asmita's question around structural barriers to teachers' agency, and also building teacher community and learning from each other, and if there's any, if that is impacted by COVID at all. I would I would start by saying that in Teacher App, because we're trying out a model of training a large pool of people at scale, we thought of creating something which is very useful for classroom, but yet research based, something that a lot of agencies are not able to provide in the ground. I've seen in India a lot of NGOs having a large pool of teacher educators and field workers who are not trained in education. And somewhere I feel that having a tool in their hands is equally important. While we have created something for self-learning, I have seen a lot of BRCs, CRCs, and even state pedagogy head using this content, that this works for me. So there has been a very positive response to this kind of a content, which is very simple in language, but not simple in thought. In terms of assessing whether it impacts students' learning outcomes, so we look at our assessment at 3 levels. One is at the level of content, and we did a quality audit in last year with around 15 teacher educator experts in India rating this content, and 15 design experts rating this content, and they rated this content high, around from 100, around 80-85% rating is what they have given to this content. That sort of created some kind of a satisfaction that we are on the right path. Uh, but we've also monitored consumption on our app very closely. So we get the data in terms of how many people start something, end something, complete something on their own, what kind of comments they write. So on each Chatshala and courses, teachers can discuss what they feel like. They can create their own post like on Facebook, and they can also comment on other people's comment as well. So I've seen a lot of organic demand there, that this was wonderful, this gave me an idea about reflection. I never thought of gender in my classroom like that. My teacher never used to check my mathematics notebook because she thought that I'm not good enough for doing mathematics, and this gender course has made me realize this. Differential teaching, I never thought of it like that. So a lot of content that's not available to teachers. This is an audiovisual interaction that teachers get in. For it to then impact their classrooms and for it to then impact the student learning outcome is a long process, because you have to build the whole distribution strategy from onboarding a user on a digital platform, through helping them consume through certain distribution strategies and training programs, to then help them reflect and then act in the classroom. So we call it OKRA, and we created an interesting blended program and an engagement cell to see whether we learn how to help teachers do that. So we can help teachers get onboarded. So we work in a B2B kind of a strategy where we work with system change players in states, and through them we onboard the teachers, and almost 85% of the teachers get onboarded on the platform within 3 to 4 months. And that has been our experience consistently with all 4 states that we have started working, and now the other 3 states have come into the ambit of our work through COVID. But in order to help teachers consume this and learn from it and act in the classroom requires another kind of a structure. A lot of other organizations have been trying for years and have not succeeded. So this requires another kind of thinking in terms of trying out various strategies of push and pull and then seeing what will work in classroom. And I've personally created a program called ACT program, in which I've created structures in which a teacher mentor can help teachers in classroom to convert this into practice. But a lot of users are practicing this in the classroom on their own also. So the around 20 to 35% people in a large population are also self-motivated, and they're showing that result. For it to then impact the student learning outcome, that's a longer journey for us. We have commissioned a random control trial with an organization called ID Insight. They were to start working in Himachal Pradesh this year, but this is extended because of COVID right now. Probably next year we will have this, where they will do a longitudinal study of the children who are taught by teachers who use Teacher App, and then gradually see that if they show sustained improvement in their learning outcomes. That's an exploration that we are also very excited to make. But I am again frugally defining it. Probably learning is impacted by so many factors. And unless we train our teachers and become sensitive around that, and we support teachers around that, all of it is not going to be changed only by a digital training strategy. Is where I am right now in terms of student learning outcomes. I do though have a lot of confidence in the kind of content we've created with the teachers and teacher educators about real classroom practices. I have also conducted an engagement cell with teachers where teachers keep asking me that what is the next course that I can do now? This has helped me in my classroom. That has happened. So I'm pretty hopeful, but until unless there's a randomized control trial that is being done or a study being done by a third party evaluator, I can't claim that it is changing students' learning outcomes.
Thank you, Sarita. So, Mohammed, do you have a comment in response to any of the questions or discussions?
Yes. So Asmita's question was directly that what do you think the current pandemic has on teachers' agency? I have a direct answer to this question that is not much related to the project that I'm working on, but an indirect answer to this question that is related to the project. Indirect answer that is not related to the direct answer that's not related to the project is in a lot of the literature we find that there are huge criticism about the shadow education, which is known as private tuition by the school teachers. Up until this COVID things impacted our life, I was seeing this as a crime. And the developing countries like Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, the government, when they hired the teachers, they offered a lower salary with the perception that teacher will be anyway earning the money through private tuition. The similar way they hired the police and give them lower salary that the police will earn a bribe, which is private tuition by teachers and police taking bribe was the same level of crime to me up until COVID. But now I'm really feeling extremely bad because their salary has not changed that much, but they have lost their private tuition income. That is impacting a lot of the teachers' life, especially who are living in the urban area and semi-urban areas. So why I'm saying this is kind of indirect is that, so that is indirectly impacting their life. The indirect impact to my project is when the teachers are demotivated, when they are struggling with their own personal problems, living and livelihood, how they're going to maintain the same level of enthusiasm, same level of spirit when they are going back to the classroom after the COVID is over. So that will create a big dent. The other thing is, which is like directly linked with my project is, we recently received the grant. So we are planning to launch the survey in December. If COVID continues, then it may push a little far. But the point is, from March until December, or if unfortunately if it goes further, the students are kind of out of the direct touch of the teachers, and also not equally engaged that they were engaged before. So that will lower their the benchmark, that where they were or where a grade 2 or grade 3 students would have been normally. So when we'll do the baseline study in end of 2020 or 2021, the benchmark will be like very low. That is going to impact my findings, because I anticipate that's not the true kind of capacity that the students have, or the true picture of the system, education system has. So I don't know how I'm going to capture that in my analysis.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. Sarah, do you have a comment?
First of all, I'd like to appreciate everybody for all the efforts they are doing to support education in our part of the world, because it is very much needed. And all these initiatives are really great. However, my concern is, and responding to some of the things that you've mentioned, Kiran, is that I see that education does contribute to improved voice for these laborers that are working. However, I see it a big challenge for the poverty-stricken countries that we are living in, because when it comes to feeding and when it comes to education, people often prefer employment, and their focus is not on education much, in terms of look at the number of out of school children that we have in these three countries. It's like in millions. And however, I am not that disheartened. I'm still hopeful when I see some of the roadside schools that are supporting literacy programs for child laborers, etc. So I feel that there needs to be more attention directed towards people and children, especially who are belonging to the impoverished segments of our society, and especially the rural population, because they don't have access to quality education. And I believe that COVID is going to pose serious challenges to our public sector education system, because majority of you have talked about the initiatives that support private schooling systems within our education systems. But when it comes to public system, they are not equipped to provide distance learning opportunities. They don't have the infrastructure in place to provide that teaching and learning opportunity to the students. And again, I fear that there are going to be so many people who will be pushed much further below the poverty line. Having said that, I would say that COVID and education is impacted, all over the world, and is going to greatly impact migrant workers all over the world, not just in South Asia or South Asian countries. And like I see, that the flow of migration is going to be greatly impacted. And even in the developed part of the world, when migrant workers are coming, though they are educated and they are, highly qualified, but still in their own, when they land to the developed countries, they land into precarious jobs, despite having good quality certificates and degrees, etc. So I don't know, I mean, I feel that there's a lot that needs to be done to improve the living conditions of people.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Asan, I don't know if you're here. I don't see Asan on the screen. I don't know if there was some technical problem, but I just thought I'd check in case Asan was on an iPhone. Okay, so
if you'd like, I can reach out to him through my phone.
I think it's okay, because we only have like a couple of minutes left. So I just wanted to see if anybody had any concluding comments that you'd like to make for the session.
I just want to thank everyone. Learned so many things, and especially thanks to you for your time and accepting the offer to facilitate. We felt like we are at OIZ.
Yeah.
So it was a very spontaneous kind of presentation, no nervousness and anything.
Yeah, so thank you. I want to also say the same, that it's kind of, you can see that, there's so much conversation to be had in terms of how, and strategies to be developed in terms of how, we can address these broader issues through research and through, through connections. And I think one of the most important features of this session is that we so rarely get to talk about the links between education and work in this kind of a way of, you know, trying to kind of really develop strategies which will address both educational exploitation and labor market exploitation together, rather than as, you know, in separate spheres. So, you know, thank you to the organizers for pulling this session together. And yeah, I just have a reminder that we do need to run on time, because we have another session at 10. So thank you all for your participation, and I hope we get to keep in touch. And I'm sorry we're not meeting face to face, but I hope in the future we'll have a chance to do that. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.